So I want to welcome everyone to the Climate Reality Bay Area Chapter's conversation with Ms. Ellie Cohen, who is the CEO of the Climate Center. And over the next hour, we will hear from Ellie on her career working on climate issues and her most recent work at the Climate Center for the past 2.5 years. And as you may not know, the Climate Center is a climate and energy policy nonprofit working to rapidly reduce climate pollution at scale. And we're going to delve into what that actually means as we get into the discussion. In a prior role, Ellie served as president and CEO of Point Blue Conservation Science and represented them at COP23 in Bonn and COP24 in Poland. So we want to hear about that too. Her stellar educational background includes a BS in botany from Duke, a master's in public policy from Harvard, and a certificate from the Executive Program for Nonprofit Leaders at Stanford. Ellie was named one of 100 women taking the lead to save our planet in the US by the National Women's History Project. And lastly, in wonderful symmetry with our own climate organization, Ellie actually attended the second ever climate reality training led by our founder and chairman, former US Vice President Al Gore back in 2007. So she was probably within the first 100 of the now 40,000 climate reality leaders that have been trained by Gore and Company. As a moderator, I will ask questions of Ellie as we engage in a conversation. And then toward the end of the program, we'll open it up for questions and comments from the audience. You know what to do. If you've got a comment or question, type it into the chat box and we'll do our best to get to it. But before we actually get started with our conversation, I want to recognize the indigenous Ohlone people who inhabited and stewarded our wonderful Bay Area region for thousands of years. Now, let's say hello to Ellie and start our conversation. Hi, Ellie.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's really—
Thank you for having us.
I feel like I'm with the family.
You are with our family. Ellie, let me start out by asking, how did you originally become interested in working on climate issues and specifically on climate policy?
I grew up in Baltimore and always on the East Coast, I was always interested in environmental stuff. In fact, I didn't really have a mentor. My family, I grew up on Broadway show tunes, but I always loved ecology and nature, and I still love Broadway. But I just, my 3 siblings are all in the arts, and I didn't really find my path until I was in college, but I always cared about nature a lot. I was passionate about it since I was very little. And I grew up during a time of great social activism, and it was really important to my family, and my parents taught us a lot. It took us to protests in Washington, D.C. in the 60s. And so it was part of my growing up to act on things that we care about and to make a difference and have responsibility, not only for ourselves and our families and our neighborhood, but for our community and for our state and for our country and for our world. And in 7th grade, I was very clear about what I was going to do.
Wow.
I decided that I was going to bring the Russians and Americans together. So this is the height of the Cold War, and bring them together through our common love of nature. And when I applied for college, I only applied to schools that had forestry and Russian. And
amazing.
So, it was, I don't even know how all that came out in my head, but that's how it came. And it turned out when I went to Duke, the forestry program at that time was quite conservative. It was all about cutting down as many trees as possible. The hallways smelled musty and old fashioned. And I quickly went to the botany program, which was much more progressive. And a few years later, it changed to be part of the ecology program, which is what I would have wanted had it been there at that time, but it wasn't. And I eventually made my way out to California doing butterfly ecology research, and was supposed to actually get a PhD in butterfly ecology at UC Davis. I had traveled to Brazil for a few months when I graduated from college and saw poverty on a scale that I had never seen before. And when I came back, the 3 Mile Island accident happened. That was in '70. And it really lit a fire under me that I couldn't just study butterflies, that I had to become active. And I became active in peace and justice organizing, anti-nuclear, environmental organizing. And after 10 or 15 years of doing that and doing fundraising and learning how to manage a business and all that, I realized I want to get back to what I loved, and that's ecology. And I got to Point Reyes Bird Observatory. I made a checklist. I thought, what are the things I love and what do I want to do? And how can I make a difference for our future through conservation? And during my tenure at Point, which is now called Point Blue Conservation Science, I was there for 20 years. And during my tenure, the organization grew 5 times over. And we went from maybe 30 scientists to 180. And that was all great. The biggest single thing that impacted me so much was actually seeing the impacts of climate change on wildlife that we were studying. And so I knew about climate change, and I've already been an activist. And it wasn't that, it was more what got me really to climate change was seeing the impacts on the habitats that we saw. And then I couldn't be stopped. In 2005, we saw complete breeding failure of one of the breeding seabirds out at the Farallon Islands. And it was completely an anomaly. It's like, why did that happen? There was enough food in the water for them. They laid their eggs, the chicks hatched, and then there was no food for them. It turns out that the krill that they feed on stay in colder water, and this huge mass of warm water moved from the Central Pacific in a very unusual way. It's exactly what climate models predicted would happen. No one could say for sure at the time that it was climate change, but then it happened again the next year. And then I was set. I read everything I could get my hands on. I'm Jewish, and in my synagogue, I just wouldn't stop saying to my rabbi, who was also a friend, you have to do more on climate change. And she said to me, I want you to do the sermon for the holiest day in the year on Judaism, called Yom Kippur. And I want you to do it on climate change and Judaism.
No pressure.
I said, no way. I'm not going to do that. I said, I'm not an expert on Judaism. I may be Jewish, but I'm not an expert on Judaism. And I'm definitely not an expert on climate change. And she said, well, that was in April and it was for early October. She said, get to work. And so I did. And every night and every weekend, I researched climate change, and I learned an enormous amount. And it actually created new habits for me. So still today, I know that maybe some of you share this with me. I enjoy reading the science news every single day, and especially about climate change. And it can be horrible news, but I love learning about it and about what does it mean I'm going to do differently today to make more of a difference.
I think you'll find that common within the Climate Reality program and the Bay Area. We're all trying to keep pace with the news that comes out, the articles about climate change, where new solutions are coming to the fore. Absolutely. And additional warnings. It's amazing. You've been doing this and thinking about this since the 7th grade. I was still imagining being a rock and roll star in the 7th grade. Obviously, that didn't happen. And then eventually I got into climate, but decades later. Let me ask you the second part of that question, which probably developed later on in your career. How did you wind up shifting to climate policy as opposed to any other aspect of the climate movement?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting story. So I was at Point Blue. I should say that it was in the fall of 2006. So of course I saw An Inconvenient Truth and thought it was the best movie I'd ever seen in my life. And other people left crying, and I was like, okay, what are we gonna do? And let's do more. And a friend of mine, I wouldn't stop talking about climate change. And one of my colleagues who actually worked with the State Coastal Conservancy forwarded this email to me that she had gotten that said that Al Gore was doing these trainings. And she said, I should apply to one of them. So I thought, okay, I'll do that. But I wrote in the note applying, I don't know what you have to do today, but then this was the fall of 2006. Apparently he had been on a radio show after his film and said, they asked him, what are you going to do next? And he said, I'm going to train thousands of people to do this. And he then actually followed through on that. And as you all know, and so I applied, but I applied saying, I don't want to do your talk. You did a great job and the movie's great. I said, I want to do it around conserving nature because nobody's talking about climate change in the conservation world that I work within. And I want to do that. So that's what I did. I went to the training, and then as you all know, I committed to doing at least 10 presentations that year. That year, I did 26 presentations on climate change. And I used some of Al Gore's slides, but I made some new ones and included some of the things we were seeing at Point Blue in terms of impacts on birds and all that. And so that was exciting. We did a lot of work on climate change in the years ahead after that. And by like 2015, 2016, I was really pleased with the direction we had gone. We had played a lead role in influencing the rest of the conservation movement in California and nationally to do a lot more on climate change. And I started thinking, this isn't enough. Like as following the science and seeing that things were happening faster and faster, that whatever the science was reporting was usually a year or two behind what we were actually experiencing. Yeah. And I started following scientists on Twitter where you could see what they thought as opposed to the way they would publish what their research was. And that was quite moving to me, actually. And I realized that we need to do more. So I started to figure out how we might do more policy at Point Blue. I got Point Blue to be an observer organization, official NGO observer to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. I went as our representative, as you mentioned, at COP23 and COP24, learned even more and had amazing experiences, got to hear globally recognized climate scientists speaking there, and was moved to do even more. And I just kept thinking, in the end, to move the needle on climate change as quickly as we need to, it's not enough to do the science. We need the science, we need the scientists, we need groups like Point Blue that do the practical application and the applied aspects of it. But I personally am thinking about my last years working full time and what I would do. I thought, I want to move the needle on climate change. I gave notice. I gave 8 months notice. I raised $1 million extra to help the next person come in. And then like my third day off, I got a call from Anne Hancock, who founded the Climate Center in 2001. And she said, Ellie, I want to talk to you. I want to have lunch together. I said, give me a couple of weeks off and then we can get together. So we eventually had lunch together, and the rest is history. We started talking about our theory of change, if you will, and really thinking about what are the levers that where we can make the biggest change is the fastest. And we looked at different aspects of history and in climate science, in particular, in climate policy. And we thought, of course, Trump was in the presidency then. And we thought we should really focus on California as the 5th largest economy in the world. It was really about policy, because in the end, local governments, nonprofits, religious entities, like business, all the different sections of society can do lots of things. But without the public policy really directing it, it can never get to the speed and scale that we need to make the difference. That was our conclusion. And I still believe that actually even more strongly today.
Well, as part of the second cohort, you probably met with Gore in his barn, correct?
No, so, well, maybe I was the third. It was January of 2007, and it was it was not on his property. I think he only did one at his barn.
Okay. And
this one was at a hotel in Memphis, I believe. It was in Memphis. And, I had never been there before, and he was there. It was amazing, like that he could speak for 8 hours. And there was a climate scientist with us, a glaciologist from Pennsylvania, whose name I forgot right now, but
yep.
And he kept, every once in a while, Mr. Gore would turn to the scientist and say, am I on track? And he would say, yes. And only once in the entire day did the scientists have a very tiny nuance to correct him. It was so inspiring and really incredible.
That sounds familiar. Yeah, we've all gone through that. Tell us a little bit more about the Climate Center, how it's organized, what type of work you guys do, any goals at this point that you've got?
Yeah. Okay, so the Climate Center, as I mentioned, was founded in 2001, and it was really focused on Sonoma County. Anne and her team did an amazing job there, and Sonoma County won some national awards recognized by the EPA and others for their cutting edge work. We're the first county in the country to establish measurable greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals. and a lot of cutting edge work being done there. And before our last couple of years, I think the Climate Center was best known for its work around community choice energy, CCA. So I live in Marin County, Marin Clean Energy, there's Peninsula. I'm sure actually where all of you live, there's different CCAs. And for me in Marin, I live in a small house on a north facing slope. We don't have enough sun to have solar cover more than 50% of our electricity use annually. And so I couldn't wait for the CCA to be existent here. And the first one in the state was here in Marin Clean Energy in 2010. The second wouldn't have happened without Ann and her team, and that was Sonoma Clean Power. And then they kept working in other towns and cities and counties and regions across the state. Today there are, I think it's 24 CCA that serve 80 to 90% greenhouse gas free electricity to 11 million Californians.
That's great.
Quarter of the state. And that was basically from 2010 to today. And the Climate Center played a huge role in that. And so it's a great example of our mission, which is speed and scale greenhouse gas reduction. When Ann and I got together, and I was thinking, where am I going to put my time? You know, I said to her, I need to do more than just energy. I'm really passionate about ecology and nature-based solutions and looking at the holistic view of everything that needs to be done to secure a healthy future for us all. And we don't live without healthy ecosystems. So it's not just about clean energy. We clearly have to cut emissions dramatically, but there are other things we need to do as well. So we came up with this concept of climate safe California. And the idea is really to get to net negative emissions by 2030, 15 years earlier than had been in any state policy, because it was to get to carbon neutrality and net negative by 2045.
Very aggressive.
Very bold. Again, it was based on what I've seen with the science and where things, how rapidly things are changing. It wasn't based on political feasibility. It was based entirely on what is our climate reality? What is the physics and the chemistry and the biology? How quickly is it changing? What do we really need to do? And that California, as the 5th largest economy in the world, has been a key leader on bold climate policy for many, many years, and starting with our tailpipe emissions law in 2002, and then of course AB 32, the California Climate Act. I forgot actually what it's called, but really significant. As soon as we pass those bold policies, other states follow, the country follows, other countries follow. We have numerous examples of it. But what's happened in the past few years is that California's leadership has fallen behind. In terms of bold goals, the EU is ahead of us. UK under conservative leader Boris Johnson is ahead of us. States like Rhode Island are ahead of us. And so what we are working to do, and we work in partnership with groups all over the state, is to get that policy in place that can then unleash innovation, drive market forces so that everybody can participate in a clean energy economy.
Ellie, what happened? How did we get left behind?
Oh, well, it's a really interesting story. It's really about the oil and gas interests and associated labor. So labor is very diverse. It's not a monolith in any way whatsoever, but the building trades in particular have really worked very hard to, and they represent a lot of the oil and gas workers in the state. They've worked to slow progress dramatically. So some of the boldest legislation over the past 4 years, maybe even 5 now, have just been killed in the dark of night. Experiencing that directly. So we've been talking, we've met with 40 or 50 members directly of the state legislature. We had scientists do a paper on the scientific basis for getting to carbon neutrality and net negative by 2030. We got media coverage on it. We did briefings for staff in Sacramento. And with all that, a member of the state Senate, Senator Henry Stern from Calabasas, who might represent some of you actually, some folks here from the Valley, he actually decided to introduce a bill called Senate Bill 582. And that was to actually achieve carbon neutrality, and net negative emissions by 2035, the first net negative emissions bill that we know of in the country. And it was very exciting. It went through 2 Senate committees and actually got passed, and then got killed in the dark of night. We all totally know what happened, but it was a big learning lesson for us at the Climate Center. At the same time, it opened up this dialogue and discussion about what's possible. We are able to influence members of the legislature, the governor's office. In fact, on Friday, July 9th at 5 p.m. Now, who would release a press release at 5 p.m. on a Friday afternoon? Somebody who wants to hide something, right? The governor released a press release saying that he had ordered the California Air Resources Board in their efforts, their scoping plan work, to assess what it would take to get to carbon neutral and net negative by 2035, 10 years earlier. First time that happened. So we're really proud of that, but there's a lot more obviously that needs to be done. And one last thing on that is just to say that Climate Safe California is about a bold, equitable vision for where we need to go. There's a whole suite of policies that have to be implemented in multiple sectors for us to get there. And our goal is to ensure that the majority of those policies are in place by 2025 so that we can get where we need to be.
I would imagine you interfaced with the governor's office during this to a greater or lesser extent. Has it been easier or more difficult working with the current governor as opposed to Jerry Brown?
Well, so the current governor has actually been in during my entire tenure as CEO at the Climate Center.
Yep.
I actually don't know, but I had met Governor Brown before. My understanding from people who've worked there on these issues before is that Governor Brown was a bolder visionary thinker. Mm-hmm. Now, in the end, how much more actually happened under him in terms of really moving the needle forward, hard to say. Governor Newsom's more of a reluctant leader, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. When the Orange Sky Day happened last September, our consultants that we work with in Sacramento set up a meeting for us to present on Climate Safe California to his main political advisor who lives in San Francisco. This man was so excited to hear a vision, a positive vision of what was possible for what we could do in California. He just kept thanking us. And it was a scary day when the sun was gone for the day. And it was a big wake up call. A lot of people that I work with who live in Sonoma County and donors of the Climate Center have firsthand lost homes, been evacuated more than once over the past 5 years. But anybody just a little further away, we haven't had that same experience. I can say it for myself. But that Orange Sky Day brought it home for most of the state. And we all experienced that heavy smoke for days on end.
Well, I'm glad that woke up the governor's office. That was very amazing when that happened. Let me backtrack a little bit, Ellie, and have you talk a little bit more about the Climate Center. You referenced quickly, but I'd like to dig deeper into it a little bit, of your theory of change. Talk about that. What does that mean?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I don't like theory. I like application. I like doing. But the theory of change, in another way of thinking of it, maybe you all are familiar with that concept, but I think of it as our main overarching strategy. And so if you think of, I worked with somebody once who always said in Greek, stratego was the general and tactico was the soldier. So if you think of the general having that big overview, like that's the big goal, like what's the big picture view? And the theory of change, our strategy, is basically that we mobilize not a huge number of people. We base some of this on a study that was done out of Harvard that showed social movements all over the world. Major social change happen when you hit a certain threshold. And even Al Gore talked about this in the training that I had with him, which is that you don't need to have a majority of people agreeing with you. You don't even need a third. He actually said sometimes it can be 20%. This study said 3% of the population. Mm-hmm. So in California, you're talking about 1.5 million people or something like that. And that's just so interesting to think about it that way. And so our theory of change is that we mobilize people who already care about climate change to do a lot more, to focus on policymakers, get those policymakers to make the bold changes, to unleash innovation, to catalyze those market forces, and to make those climate solutions available in an equitable way for everybody. And an example of it would be solar power, where even 5 years ago, no one thought that solar would be the cheapest form of electricity by 20. Mm-hmm. And it just exploded, but it started with policies that particularly government policies that invested public money into it to allow it to the science to happen, the technology, then more companies took it on. The other policies changed to get higher percentage of electricity from solar. And before you know it, it just took off. And it's still taking off all over the world. And that can happen with almost any technology that is clean and that takes us to a hopeful future.
You mentioned the 3% study. I'm familiar with that. It's done by, I think it was Erica Chenoweth,
Yes.
who's a social scientist from Harvard. And it's the study that actually Extinction Rebellion bases their philosophy upon, which is you only really need a vanguard activism of 3% of the population, and then people come along and they point out how that happened in the civil rights era, in the women's movement, in the anti-war movement. People now in retrospect think it took 75% of people or whatever, and that's not even close. It was a very, very small minority.
Yeah. Being really active and
yes,
in a very strategic way, right?
Yes, yes. Let me also go to another aspect of the center's structure, if you will, or organization. I noticed when I went to the website, there's a prominent section on guiding principles. Tell us about that.
Oh yeah, thank you, Gary. I appreciate that. So we have 3 guiding principles that are at the basis of everything that we do in our whole Climate Safe California campaign. And the first is that it's based on the latest science, like where it's not being pulled out of thin air. It's based on science, not just the science of the solutions, but the science of the reality of climate change. So we're always pushing the envelope about what's possible. And we're doing that, again, not just with elected officials and decision makers, we're doing that with our partners across California. There are dozens of organizations working at the state level on climate change from all over California. It's very siloed in many ways. And we see our goal and role as a convener, but also a catalyst. As people have been doing it for a long time, they get a little burned out, they get jaded. Oh, we weren't able to do this 2 years ago. It's like, it doesn't matter. This is the reality that we face. We have to think bigger. We have to do more faster at scale. And so we've been able to influence some of our partners to start shifting their thinking by bringing the latest science to them. Secondly, we know that we want no one left behind, literally. So that means the oil and gas workers as well. So we strongly support a just transition. And in any piece of legislation or policy that we work on, if it's relevant, we include in there just transition. And just transition really means it's some people in labor don't like that. They might call it equitable transition, but the concept is that you ensure that the workers who are dependent on fossil fuel industries for their day-to-day living and their families and their communities are taken care of as we transition rapidly to a clean energy economy. We have to do that. We have to take responsibility for everyone. And third is climate justice. And that's really, in my opinion, racial justice, because for the history of oil and gas, we have ensured that oil and gas infrastructure, even freeways, have been always located in the lowest income neighborhoods, which are often communities of color. And it's the areas that you have the highest health issues related to oil and gas production and use. And so we know that, and COVID has taught us this, that you can't really make change without addressing everybody. And so it's morally correct, it's economically correct, it's socially correct. We need to ensure that we are engaging with and in hearing the voices and promoting the voices of the lower income communities and communities of color, so that we are all working on this together for solutions that really work at scale.
Very good, very good.
Principles, and I'll tell you one example real quickly of a success that we've already had by applying that, particularly on climate justice. So we have experts on staff who are real, like, whiz kids on energy policy in California. And we started convening in August last year a microgrid equity coalition. So we have represented different environmental justice organizations who have expertise in energy, working together with some of the more traditional other groups working on energy, and all working together. They meet regularly. And in January, they actually became parties to proceedings at the California Public Utilities Commission. And won $200 million in January for application to develop microgrids in prioritizing low-income communities based on Cal EnviroScreen, which prioritizes communities based on income and other issues. And it was huge. And that group has grown now. We continue to be parties to these proceedings, and we are able to influence policy at the state level by bringing all these voices together.
That's excellent. Ellie, let me shift the discussion a bit. COP26 obviously has been in the news. It was recently convened and completed. I'd be curious, and maybe our listeners would be as well, since you've been to COPs, I don't know whether or not you were 26. Were you at the most recent one?
Yes, I was.
Great. So you've been to 3 of them. What is it like to be at these events? What kinds of access do you have? What types of meetings do you take? What kind of impact can one person have?
That's a really good question. So I'm going to tell you from a more personal point of view, and then I'll tell you from a more policy perspective. I just should say, when I came to the Climate Center, having had that experience at Point Blue, I thought, well, we focus on California, but let me apply for us to become a UN Observer NGO also and see what happens. So I put in the application, I don't know when it was, last December, maybe, and I forgot about it, actually. And then at the end of July, I got this email saying that we were a new NGO observer to the UNFCCC. And I was like, oh, that is so exciting. And what I learned that I didn't do at Point Blue was that we could actually sponsor, meaning we could get badges, we could get entry for anybody that we made as part of our delegation. So we were able to have 2 state senators and an assembly member go, 2 state staffers who lead on climate issues. And one of the staffers that we offered it to, who ended up being able to go another way, was the lead staff person in the Assembly Speaker's office, Anthony Vinton. And she's always been, the guard at the gate. She was doing her job. But when we called to offer her this, she was almost giddy and bubbly. And then we were best friends all of a sudden. And just say that being able to offer this to people opened up doors for us. And more than anything, my goal was to we ended up having, I think, 15. We had 3 that we sponsored. There were 15 elected officials from the state, from the legislature, that went to COP26, and a number of others from the Newsom administration. My goal was to get as many of them as possible to talk to their equivalent person from other countries and learn about what other countries are doing and learn about how California has fallen behind. And amazingly, the speaker was interviewed by Cal Matters while he was there. And the headline was, California is behind. And that's what we've been saying for 2.5 years. So it was just so thrilling. Like every one of them, they saw what's being done in other countries for heat waves and adaptation. They saw what was being done with offshore wind. They saw, like, just in almost every area, they saw transportation, things being much more aggressive than what we're doing here in California. So I think it was a really big wake-up call for a lot of them. And a funny thing is that the access to California officials is much easier in that setting than here in California, in part because we're all observers. We're all equal footing there. And it's an amazing thing. So you get to meet with these state senators and assembly members and key staffers and have some very great conversations in a whole different setting. So that's fantastic.
That sounds great. As you know, at COP26, there was a huge demonstration and march outside. I think something like 100,000 people. Greta was even there and a lot of other leaders. Did that have any kind of impact or get any attention of leaders inside? And if so, how did it impact them?
Yeah. So first of all, I went that day and I was at that march and it was a highlight. It was fantastic to be at it. I have to say that was the coldest I was the whole time I was there, because it poured down rain and then it was these blustering winds, and but it was fantastic and unbelievable. I mean, it really was 100,000 people. It was a lot of people. What was amazing to me, there were signs all over the place, all in for 1.5. They were saying the right things. We still have to do the right walk, but they were talking the talk. And that was surprising. They were acknowledging the young people that were out there. They talked a lot about climate justice. And in the context globally, it meant really the same thing it means in California, but the way they talked about was the global north in a very versus the global south.
Yep.
North being the industrialized countries that made most of the climate pollution, but aren't taking responsibility for these communities that are being devastated already by it. And that was a lot of the discussions. How do you pay for the resilience efforts that are needed immediately for small island nations, which they themselves call themselves big ocean nations, and you know, countries in Africa and South America and Asia. It was really powerful. So I actually think that those protests made a difference, and that the leaders, at least it got into the lexicon, let's put it that way. They were acknowledging the protesters. They were acknowledging young people's needs. They were acknowledging frontline communities all over the world that are receiving the brunt of it. So for me, the biggest shift from what I experienced before was that they're saying some of the same things I would say. We have to make it real. That means holding them accountable and turning that into policies that are accelerated, that are equitable, and that really make the difference that's needed. And that was a much more mixed bag. I did my last day there. Have any of you ever been to any of these meetings?
I haven't.
Diana, you have?
People, yeah.
Okay. Well,
Right.
it's unbelievable because you're there with, you know, there were 30,000 people signed up for this. They said they were going to limit it to 10,000 people a day because of COVID. But you know, there you are with, you know, thousands of your best friends from all over the world. You can just stop and talk to anybody of any ethnic background, any language, and you can start talking about climate change and have these amazing conversations. And
it sounds like an amazingly impactful experience. I would love to have one. And, you know, talk about being surrounded by like-minded people. It's got to be incredible. Let me shift, though, to COP26, and I want to get your perspective on wins and losses coming out of that particular COP.
So I overall was disappointed, to be really honest, because you have the top scientists in the world presenting to these decision makers. But you have to remember that the UN operates by consensus. And so what it means is that it's remarkable that the Paris Agreement from 2015 came out as it did, and that actually had the agreement of every country in the world ultimately signed on to this to keep below 2 degrees Celsius warming and preferably below 1.5. I mean, that's quite amazing. And one of the great things is that you have all these countries of the world represented, these enormous halls with the nameplates of every country in the world there. I mean, that is incredible. And as you all know, problem solving starts with bringing people together. And so that does happen through the UNFCCC. And that gives me chills right now, just thinking of it. Like and it's exciting to witness. The reality is that you have some bullies, or, well, they're not always bullies, but how I view them, you have the oil producing countries like Russia, Saudi Arabia, and others. You have United States that even under Biden, still they put words for the very first time in a written agreement after 26 of these meetings. So it was started, officially agreed to the United Nations Framework and Convention on Climate Change in 1992, the first COP, Conference of the Parties being every nation, a nation of the world. The first one was in 94, and this year was the 26th one. Last year was delayed because of COVID. And never have they talked about the actual cause of global warming, or the biggest source of it being the burning of fossil fuels.
It's amazing.
It's unbelievable. So this year they had wording in there that said something like the phase down of coal and fossil fuel subsidies. United States, apparently, this is one rumor, and I don't know if it's true, but I heard that the United States made sure it didn't talk about natural gas. Isn't that interesting? So we play a big role, our country, and as refreshing as it is to have the Biden administration compared to the Trump administration, we know, as you all know, there's quite a bit more to do.
Yeah, I also heard that coming out of the conference, the issue around coal where most countries wanted to see it completely erased. They talked about being phased down as opposed to totally phased out. So
Right.
there was some hedging going on there as well.
Yeah, so I was there that last night, and a friend of mine who's been to many of these said, just always make your ticket a day later because it almost always goes over. So I did, and I was glad I was there. And what happened was, so they had all agreement, like all the had agreed on certain language, and they came back, and it was called to order. So you have somebody representing every country of the world there, and then India raises their hand and said, "We don't agree with this." And boy, some people were angry at them. But you know, the truth is, like, we could be angry at our own country for not having done more. But they were angry because they want to change it because they rely on coal for their economic growth in a big way, much bigger than we do now in the United States. And so it is a little bit about climate justice and how we view what's right from our point of view at the US versus in India, a very, you know, big developing economy. And we do need to get rid of coal, but they changed it from to phase down.
Yeah.
People were upset, and some people spoke from some of the island nations and others, and being somebody spoke from the EU, very moving. And anyway, they ended up keeping that language in the interest of moving forward and again getting to consensus. And there were some other things that came out of just people coming together. 130 countries signed on to a methane pledge. Cut methane by 30% by 2030. Not enough, but fantastic to even put methane in the limelight and to think more about short-lived climate pollutants, which probably have played a big role in accelerating the speed at which we're seeing climate deterioration. There was an agreement around stopping deforestation by 2030, but immediately, like within a day, Indonesia said they didn't agree to that. And Brazil gave lip service, but not really. So, you know, there are issues there. One exciting thing was a new coalition that was formed, led by Denmark and Costa Rica, called Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance. So that was the first time something like that happened. That was fantastic. So, you know, there were some really good things. They committed to giving more money through these various mechanisms, but they had committed to some of these things since 2009, and you know, it hasn't really been followed through. So
well, it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. You know, the ultimate issue will be how much of this will actually be implemented, and the fact that they're going to readdress national determined goals next year in Egypt and not wait for another 5 years, I think is a really good thing as well.
Yes, doing it on an annual basis,
Yeah.
and it's so. Like, that's the kind of thing we should be doing in policy for California as well. Like, we should require, and they do give annual updates, but we should require much more stringent measures of how much progress has to be done each year. Very clear goals and deadlines. Absolutely.
So, Ellie, what I want to do now, I want to open it up to some questions. If people have any, you know, please put your name in the chat so I can recognize you. There is one question.
But before, can I say, I just want to say one other thing about the COPs.
Sure.
Me, I love the science, so I go to as many science talks as I can, and I can tell you more about the COPs and how they work and all that, because they're huge. They're like giant trade shows, but there are multiple presentations happening simultaneously, and some are on these screens that are all over the place that are official, but there are dozens of other things happening at the same time. And one of them was a talk that I heard that was at the Methane Pavilion that was sponsored by Environmental Defense Fund. You can actually find it online and see some of these talks. And if you would like, I can try to find that link for you. But one of the speakers was this professor from the UK named Tim Lenton, who was one of the co-authors of the tipping points paper. It came out in 2010, and another one came out in 2019 showing that 9 of 15 global climate tipping points have already been activated, like the slowing down of the conveyor belt in the Atlantic, the melting of the permafrost, the melting of Greenland, the melting of West Antarctica, the drying out of the Amazon, those kinds of things, all these different tipping points that are all connected to one another. And he was talking about all that and saying what's already happening today in West Antarctica, on the West Antarctic ice sheet, and how he thinks maybe we've already lost it. Like, it's in process. See us. Like, I mean, this was quite ominous. And he made the point that here we are at 1.1, 1.2 Celsius warming already. And he said, people don't realize, like decision makers don't realize, even many of us climate activists don't realize that every 1/10 of a degree warming is not equal. It's actually, each one is significantly worse, more like an earthquake scale. It's not linear. And so I just think it was such a powerful point. I just want to share that with you because I think it's worth sharing with others, that in essence, every increment of global warming means even larger changes in extreme events. And that's what we saw over the past 6 or 8 months. We're seeing. And
I think that's really important because that's something that we've been talking about at the chapter as well. People get so focused on entire whole degrees or even half degrees, 1.5, but fractions of degrees matter as well, as you point out, and they have a really big impact. Let me go to the first question that I've received, which is, how can interested volunteers get involved in the work of the Climate Center, and what potential roles might they be able to play?
That is great. So I think of the Climate Center as a think tank, do tank. So we write policy, we write white papers. Like we drafted the paper about the science and then got scientists to take it and run with it and make it their own and then get it published. We're working on a paper right now that we'll release in a few weeks on how we can get physically and biologically to 100 million metric tons extra sequestered in California soils and habitats and wetlands by 2030. It's all about the political will, right? And so we're just keep putting out that science that shows how we can really get there. And putting the caveats out there, recognizing how hard it would be to do that, but helping everybody to think bigger, faster. And maybe you can help us with some of that. Another thing
that'd be great.
If people have expertise in any of these policy areas, we'd love that. Another way to help is we actually just recently established a C4, and we are just today, probably, the paper submitted for a PAC that we're calling Climate Safe California. We're working with a handful of other organizations. There aren't many that work on electoral, like electing climate champions in the California state legislature and then holding them accountable so that the oil and gas folks are always going to give more money than we'll be able to give. But if we have that grassroots power behind it, we'll be able to hold them accountable and make it clear that they're not going to stay elected in their district.
That's great. And offline, Ellie, maybe you and I could talk about how the two organizations might be able to collaborate.
Okay, I would love that. That would be great. So there, once we determine what districts we'll work in, which we haven't, we'll be able to ask for some help with that as well.
Okay, another question, very timely. Climate anxiety is becoming an ever greater problem. What do you and your staff do to deal with anxiety or depression due to climate change?
That's a good question. Well, we have, for our first time since I've been at the Climate Center, had an in-person retreat the first 2 days of November. And I actually left from the retreat to go to Glasgow. And we decided that for that retreat, since, you know, obviously COVID has colored a lot of our feelings about everything the past 2 years, we decided that the whole retreat would be about getting to know one another and appreciate one another. So we did talk about climate change. We could not, but it was much more about getting to know each other. And we have a staff person in Los Angeles and somebody in Fresno and somebody in Sacramento and someone in Stockton, and just to get together and be together. And so for me, that was a real antidote to climate depression. And I would say, I mean, I am an optimist, as you probably can hear. And so I wake up almost every day with an attitude like, we can do it. Because I've seen amazing things happen when people get together and dream of what's possible and make it happen. Maybe not exactly what you first dreamed of, but I do believe that we can always make a difference. And so, you know, we talk weekly. We set up what we call the water cooler meeting that we do by Zoom that we did during COVID, but we're still going to continue it because we have decided to be a completely online organization. We don't have an office anymore. Decided that we don't need to pay for people to travel together except when we're going to all meet together, maybe twice a year. And so we just try to inspire one another. It doesn't mean that we deny sad feelings. We recognize it and we work through it, but the real antidote is working on making change and change you think is meaningful. And that can happen in every sector of society, at every level of government. It has to happen in every sector of society.
Well, it sounds great. It sounds as though the organization is cognizant of that reality, really focused on it. And I would agree, and many others have talked about this as well, that if you want hope, you have to be active. If you want to be depressed, pull back. But really being active and seeing changes are what make this important. Another quick one. This is interesting. What do you think of the current effort by utilities in California wanting to assess additional monthly fees on solar?
Yeah.
I can tell you what I would think, but you tell us.
Yeah, like, forget it. They're not going to win. We're going to fight that really hard with many others. Just today, I think it was, one of our partners, Environment California, delivered 120,000 messages to the governor's office to say, we need the governor to intervene on that. Like, and the whatever the PG&E submitted on that was outrageous. I know that. And so, and actually they did it with some of the other investor-owned utilities. You know, what they're trying to do, in my opinion, is just like the oil and gas stranglehold. They're trying to slow down our progress so that they can maintain their monopolistic hold on energy. Well, think about it, like 110 years ago, we were glad to have these investor-owned utilities. We couldn't imagine producing our own electricity at our own home. And you know, the whole goal of the transmission system 100 years ago was to make sure that every person in our country had access to electricity, no matter how far away they lived from an urban area. And so we have this incredible transmission system. Today, if you were going to reinvent the whole thing, you would do it completely differently in terms of climate change, but also even in terms of what makes sense about where people live and communities. And you would make it islandable so that when there is a power outage, whether it's planned or unplanned, that you can manage it and have some islands of electricity. Anyway, bottom line is I think it's terrible, and I think it's to undermine and slow the effort that has been so huge to get solar on every roof. We need more solar on rooftops. We need solar in every brownfield. We need ways to decentralize energy. At the Climate Center, we do believe there's a key role for investor-owned utilities, but we see that as in partnership with municipalities and CCAs and what individuals do.
Ellie, I would go further than that. I think it's totally unconscionable. And it's amazing to me how brazen PG&E, the poster child of failed utilities, can try to be in the midst of the tsunami of solar that's already happened and continuing. Let's see, I think we have time for maybe one or two more. Okay, here's a question. How can we take away the solar license, a social license of oil and gas? They contribute to pollution that takes almost 1 in 5 lives globally, worse than guns, tobacco, and drugs. What about oil and gas? What can we do about that?
I think it happens through a number of ways. One is through policy, and that's what we and a number of other organizations are working on in the state, which is, you know, how do we make that just transition as quickly as possible? How do we make other forms of energy so readily available and so cheap, and make it so that it's the no-brainer way to go, and the market forces drive us that way. You think about nuclear, that I often get asked, well, what do you think about nuclear power? Like, you know, whether I'm for it or against it, it's the economics of it that have killed it in the United States. And, you know, it's been 3 decades or more since a new nuclear plant has been licensed. And I think it'll be the same with oil and gas. The question's how fast will that come? And I think we need to call them out. We need to publicize it. We need to talk about it. We need to call them out. When I say that, I mean for their lies, which continue to this day. You all, I'm sure you're familiar with this, but there's a great book called Merchants of Doubt, by Naomi Oreskes. And it's just an incredible book about the history of using just a handful of scientists who don't reflect the majority, but to keep doubting that we're doing the right thing. And you can see what utilities are doing right now. Their biggest message point right now is they're worried about low-income people not being able to afford rate increases, because that's what's going to happen if we keep having solar rooftops. It's like, yeah, all of a sudden you care about low-income people?
Yeah,
Sure.
right. Unbelievable.
Yeah. So
Unbelievable.
anyway, I think it happens at different levels. We need more spokespeople questioning it, again, in every sector. And we and market forces together are going to delegitimize it. It's already happening. The Dow, Exxon's no longer on the Dow. You have like the oil companies scrambling to try to figure out what they're going to be doing and how they make this transition at the same time as they're still buying new oil and gas leases. I think we've seen peak oil myself.
Yep. Yeah. Well, Ellie, I'm sorry to say that we are out of time. I could talk with you for another hour or two. You've got such great energy and wonderful insight. We're going to have to end it right now, but I want to thank you. This has been awesome. Thank you for all the work you're doing and the Climate Center is doing. We'll be in touch with you as an organization to see how we might collaborate. But once
Thank
again,
you. I would invite you all to go to theclimatecenter.org or climatesafeca.org and endorse our Climate Safe California campaign. And let's work together. My email is ellie@theclimatecenter.org. And if you have ideas about things we can do, like, let's continue the conversation. Thank you for everything all of you do. Like, I really feel we're in this together, and I'm grateful to you. So thank you.
Well done. Thank you, Ellie, and take care, everyone. See you next time.
All right. Be well.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone. Appreciate it.
Thank
Thanks so
you.
much. Bye-bye.